thank you very much indeed for joining us for this session. We appreciate it. Thanks very much to those of you who are watching online. Hi, I'm Ros Atkins from BBC News, and I'm joined on today's panel by Errin Haines, who's editor-at-large of The 19th, which is a brilliant, relatively new website. How old are you?
2 and counting.
Okay. And Emily Bell, who's the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism head, and she's here as well. We were going to be joined by Vivian Schiller from the Aspen Institute, but unfortunately Vivian isn't able to be here, so it's the three of us for the next hour. And we're really trying to explore what a post-truth world means, to what degree that's an accurate description of the moment that we've reached, and also to what degree journalism has managed to respond to it, or how it may need to respond to it in the future. And so I suppose, Errin, I would start, well, with both of you, but Errin first. Do you recognize the description of a post-truth world?
Well, I think, it is a question of framing, right? I mean, I think much like we realized that, after the election of President Barack Obama in 2008 that we were not a post-racial society, right? The moment that we now find ourselves in is not so much about post-truth, but it is about an attack on the truth, right? As we talk about a decline in trust in media that is really part of an overall conversation, both in my country, America, but really globally, about what it means to have traditional ideas of power and who has it and who should be allowed to have it threatened in our society and in our democracies. And what the response to that is, part of that I think we have seen is an attack on the media that is working to erode trust in the press as an institution of freedom, democracy, and truth.
And why did you conclude that creating something new in the 19th was a necessary response to that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it absolutely was a response for us, because what we know at the 19th, what we believe is that getting to a post-truth world in journalism means that you can no longer rely on traditional standards of gatekeeping and storytelling and the people who are doing that gatekeeping and storytelling to get to a new normal for our industry, right? I think in particular the reckoning of the last couple of years around issues of inequality, at the center of that is our institutions, right? And journalism as an institution is not immune from that reckoning. And so in that, I think that what we concluded at the 19th was, particularly for political journalism, we know that has for too long been too white and too male. And so if we were going to change the conversation around our politics, around our political journalism, we had to change who was doing that storytelling. And so that is what we decided was that the fastest and best way for us to do that was to simply start over, right? To try to build not only the coverage, but also the culture that a lot of us wish we'd had earlier in our careers. But I think also part of it too is that for legacy mainstream institutions that are still left behind and are still doing that work, right? This is also their work. It's a different kind of work than the work that I'm doing now, but it is still work that is very necessary because these institutions are media institutions of record in many cases, and what they are holding forth as really the first drafts of history, still matters. But what we know is that they are going to have to be more honest and accurate about who and where we are as a democracy and as a society.
Thank you. And Emily, that's interesting to hear Errin talk about how this isn't just about journalism defending itself from attack, that it also needs to respond and accept that it too needs to change.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Errin has said. And I've sort of, I've really resisted using the phrase post-truth society because I think it's one of those things which kind of comes over as, oh, hey, we're all living in a society now where, like, you get your truth and I get my truth and everybody, and that is not the case. So if you look at Russia is a post-truth society at the moment. There is anyone who speaks the truth will go to jail. Outlets that report the truth have all been closed down. Soldiers, if you listen to Russian soldiers who are in Ukraine, their version of what is happening and why it's happening is completely at odds to the actual political reality of it. And we've seen how regimes like Putin build narratives over time, and how the kind of plurality of media and voice, not just in Russia but in other authoritarian states and dictatorships, has narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. So I think that, you know, something is happening in the broader world which is very, very dark. And at the leading edge of it is a set of politicians who would seek to advance a post-truth society. And as journalists, we absolutely have to resist that. And we have to resist it knowing that, exactly as Errin said, you know, if you were in Europe, if you were in America, if you were in other parts of the world, you know, any time from sort of like 1950 onwards, if you were a marginalized community, if you're a woman, you're a person of color, whatever, a lot of what you saw in the mainstream media didn't really bear any sort of, wasn't truthful about
your truth was either not reflected or it was inaccurate.
Not reflected, inaccurate through somebody else's lens. And I think sort of that adjustment, it is absolutely happening. But I think what we also have to be really aware of in rooms like this, Bridge is, or have you heard, has anyone in this room heard of Project Rockbridge? You may not have done because it was only announced yesterday. So this is Peter Thiel, who is one of the founders of PayPal, multi-billionaire, very recently on the Facebook board, supporter of Donald Trump. Rebecca Mercer, who lives on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, is the daughter of Robert Mercer, billionaire hedge fund owner. They funded Breitbart, Cambridge Analytica, etc. Project Rockbridge is a 30 million injection to reshape, quote unquote, the Republican Party in America. And when you read the details of the document that the New York Times had yesterday, it says we're going to reshape it through investigative journalism. We're going to reshape it through public relations. So you read this sort of manifesto, and one of the things that's happening in America right now, you know, which is the beacon of democracy in the free world, is that you have a completely alternative media ecosystem being built, like right under our noses.
Absolutely.
And you have great new newsrooms like the 19th. You have pretty strong, long-standing institutions like the Washington Post and the New York Times. But, you know, the money is that there's a lot of money that's going into operations that don't look that dissimilar to some of the sort of Russian operations, and undermining the credibility of the media, of reporters and journalists, is their number one tactic. And it's not new. It's like I was saying to my class the other day, how many of you here have heard of Joseph Goebbels? And fortunately, because there's journalism school, at least half of them had, and the other half I was like, you need to learn it. And one of them actually said, look, do we really have to keep going back to World War II? And I said, actually, you do have to go back to World War II, because that playbook, which is invert the truth, discredit the press, it's there, it's written down. You know, Hitler's head of propaganda wrote that down, and they followed that playbook, and you see it in every single part of the world, every single contested election right now. It's happening right now. Question, what do we do about it? I mean, I kind of, you know, and I think that, you know, actually I'm sort of really inspired by how, so people are always going, oh, journalism doesn't change. It's not. I'm really inspired by how much change there's been in the field just in the last 5 years, I would say, and even the last 2 years, 2.5 years, all down to Errin, actually. But there's a lot of change in the field right now. Is there enough? Are we doing enough?
Right.
Do we really realize what the level of the emergent, you know, because I think, so Natalia Antilova from Coda Story was here yesterday, and she said, you know, this is a war. We're in a war. And I do think that that's the case, and it's very sort of, and I think that sort of organizing ourselves, that we realize what these realities are, is really important as a field. And it's really important to know that we are both in the story and reporting on the story.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think that that's a really big adjustment that journalists also have to make, that you're no longer kind of up here. You know, you're right in.
Yeah.
And Ros, Ros, your work actually reflects that, I think.
And that we are also living this. And I love the point that Emily's making about the reality that this is a war on the truth, right? Like that is a lot of what we are talking about here. And yet, the way that we are covering this, the way that we are responding to this as an industry doesn't always feel like it is a response that necessarily meets the moment. It is not a response that really dramatizes the stakes of the moment that we now find ourselves in. Ros, I'm wondering if you agree with that and what you think journalism's response has been to this moment.
Well, I definitely think that if you go back not very many years, I would sit in conferences and panels of this nature, and it felt like journalists were stomping their feet going, the world's changing and we don't like it, we want it to stay exactly how it is. And I felt like journalism was saying, no, but hold on, we have this set of procedures, why is this not enough for the world? And it seemed to me we needed to accept that we needed to change and we needed to adapt the way we manifest our efforts to report the world. The only part that I'm a little uncomfortable with in the language you're using, Emily, is that undoubtedly some people are picking a fight with journalism. They are trying to undermine it, they're trying to say this doesn't work, they're trying to say the work that we do isn't based in truth. I think there's a risk if you accept the fight directly. So if you look at the way that Donald Trump and his supporters, when he was president, attacked certain parts of the US media, some of the US media said, we're not getting into that fight, we're going to carry on reporting. Part of the US media said, we definitely are getting in that fight. And for me, when I do journalism, my primary purpose, all of our primary purpose, I guess, is to accurately reflect the world that we're living in. I sometimes worry if we take the bait when we're being attacked, that our purpose becomes beating the people who are attacking us rather than reporting the world accurately. And so I feel while you can't ignore the threats, there's a risk if the threat becomes the central guide to your journalism that perhaps you start getting pulled away from the reason we all became journalists.
Yes, so I completely take your point. And actually, I didn't really mean to suggest that the right tactic is to directly get it. The right tactic is to actually acknowledge the fact that you're being undermined and attacked from the right, and then think about not necessarily sort of wading into it, with Fox News, etc., etc.
Sure.
That's not necessarily the right tactic or the right response.
And because what Ros is talking about, like that response is a response that puts us on defense, right? When what we need to be is on offense, right? And so, rather than kind of going along with the idea of a post-truth society, which none of us as journalists, I think, accept or are willing to accept, right? I think that what you were talking about really is for us to lean even more into what the core tenets of journalism are, right?
Exactly.
Leaving behind the most honest and accurate record of who and where we are as a democracy and a society, afflicting the comfortable, right?
Yep.
And comforting the afflicted, and speaking truth to power.
Yeah.
If that is not what we are here to do, and the more that we do that, I think the more that we are responding. But again, that requires us to leave behind norms like the myth of objectivity, which I absolutely reject, and I think that a lot of us reject at the 19th because we know that objectivity is a myth. When your default setting is being white and male, it is very easy to talk about objectivity as a way to make certain people feel comfortable and as a way to, frankly, minimize or erase the experiences of other people, right? So when we're having this conversation about voting rights, for example, in the United States, the attack on voting that we have seen as a direct response to the record voter turnout that we saw in 2020, trying to tell a story about voting rights versus election integrity, we know that that's BS.
So help me understand this. So if you reject objectivity, if you're saying we all as journalists bring our own
lived experiences to the
lived
work,
experiences,
absolutely.
how do we explain those biases to the people who are consuming our journalism? If you're saying each and every one of us is different, how do we explain the context of our individual journalism or our institutional journalism to give our consumers a better understanding of where each of us is coming from?
I don't even know if it's so much about explaining that as opposed to helping people to understand that there is value in those lived experiences and value in a diversity of lived experience and how that how we put that lens on the stories that many of us who were not those storytellers and gatekeepers, but are uniquely qualified to tell those stories, and who frankly saw a lot of this post-truth world coming before a lot of other people chose to see it or chose to acknowledge it in journalism. That is the thing that I think now needs to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, I just want to channel Tom Rosensteel for a moment, he's an old white dude, but he actually says that, so Tom wrote something called The Elements of Journalism with Bill Kovacs, and he's a really thoughtful thinker about this, and he was challenged on objectivity, and he was saying that, people talk about objectivity in the way, that Errin was explaining and rejecting, and he said, I kind of frame it slightly differently, which is I say, for journalists, it's about elevating inquiry above belief, and I use that with my students a lot, because it's like saying, look, we all know that climate science is real, or there's overwhelming scientific evidence that it's real, and you may well believe that very strongly. I run a research centre. We talk to activist organisations all the time. We sometimes work with them, but what they do and what we do is slightly different. Like Greenpeace, they're an activist organisation. They have one goal. And they will use tactics to achieve that goal. And we might agree or not agree with what they're, kind of working towards. But our job, as Errin says, is to really double down on assembling, the facts, verifying the facts, putting them in the context of the current moment. And occasionally, you will. It's really useful actually to get activists in to talk to journalism students. Rebecca Len from Avaz came in to talk to my students, and she said, look, we're not the same. And it was really good for them to hear from that perspective. She said, we often work together, we often use now the same tactics, but I have an aim in my work, and your aim is different. It's, yours is to keep this record, report the truth. Those lines are blurring, but I think for journalists, it's beholden to us to just not be kind of like sloppy about our work and not say, hey, it's going to be all right because we hold the ring on this.
But can I get us to get into the practicalities here? Because I'm sure most of us sitting here in the room would agree that we want to create a fair representation of the moment that we're trying to describe, whatever the story is that we're working on or the situation. I guess my question is, given that the information ecosystem we exist in is so rapidly changing, and the societies we exist in are so rapidly changing, how does that manifest itself? So how do we show something, in practical terms, when we put something in a story or a report of ours, how do we demonstrate that that is truthful? And then a further challenge is, how do we make that popular? How do we make people want that? Because we have to acknowledge that not everyone at the moment is motivated by their information being truthful. They're motivated by other reasons to consume that information too. And so, Errin, when you're putting a story together, how do you think about demonstrating the truthfulness of it, and how do you make sure that truthfulness has a value to the audience you're trying to reach?
Yeah, okay, so let me just start by saying, I do not necessarily cede ground to, the people who have just abandoned truth and have decided that that is not important, that a shared set of facts is not important, and that their feelings take precedent over facts and the truth, right? There are certainly a plurality, if not a majority, of people in my country, in the world, who actually are interested in journalism that is truthful, that is factual, that is accurate, right? Those are certainly the people that that I know that I'm able to reach, right? I think our challenge has been the rise of people who are no longer in that category, right? Who have either moved out of that category, were never in that category to begin with, are not coming back from that category. What do we do about those people? And I think we must continue to press the case as journalists. I think that you're seeing journalists be a lot more transparent about our process, a lot more transparent about how we are getting stories, about who we are talking to for stories, about who we are as journalists, about the experience that we have, both professional and, like I said, that lived experience that we bring to the work. You know, we are engaging with our public, our audiences a lot more so that they know who it is that they are talking to. I think the institution certainly has always mattered a lot for people who are consumers of news, but increasingly it is the people that make up those institutions and the work that they do, and getting more familiar with that part of what we do that is helping. I think I'm going to say that it is helping for people to build trust, because we are building relationship and being in community a lot more with our audiences than we have necessarily had to have been in the past.
Sorry, Emily, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to agree with that, and I was also going to say it's kind of interesting that, so I think, you know, as Errin was saying, there's sort of two sides to this, one of which is that engagement with your audience, the other of which is how you actually assemble your stories and how you account for them, and that's everything really from making data available, making your process transparent. You know, we've seen Ukraine is, I mean, it's very specific, I think, when you get into conflict reporting, but something like OSINT has become suddenly sort of much more important. You're getting stories kind of checked, verified in real time with things like visual data. But it's also important that we have to understand that helping people through the environment we're in is actually quite important. I think, you know, Ros, you do a great job of this, which is people don't really know why they're seeing certain messages. You know, they don't like, how is it that this is being told to me?
That's true.
Why am I seeing this right now? Who is telling me this? And the explanation of that, and just showing people, you know, this is where the money comes from. So again, you know, voter rights in America, it's like, where is the money coming from that's funding all of these kind of challenges to democracy? You know, in state houses now, you have laws being passed in the United States. For those of you not from America, you may be slightly shocked to hear this, which is basically going to allow state houses to overwrite the results of elections that they do not think are fair. So the midterms in America are really, really important, because if that flips the House, you are literally going to be in a country where in certain state houses, you'll be able to say those elections, you know, Maricopa County, Arizona, we don't agree with it.
We don't trust that outcome.
We don't trust that outcome. We will take over. It's so important to have a record of who is paying for that, where did it come from, why are those messages being deployed, how does it work? And I think that, you know, that's just about adjusting your work a little bit and realizing that you're going to be challenged, you know, that you have to have the evidence.
And the only other thing I would add to this, Ros, is just in terms of building trust and credibility. Who is delivering that journalism? Who is delivering that message? Again, diversity and representation matters.
Yes.
If you have audiences who are not seeing themselves reflected in these newsrooms, if they are not seeing themselves reflected, they are going to be that much more skeptical about the message, and that's just the truth, and that is something that newsrooms have to recognize and they need to respond to.
So that's a macro institutional change that needs to happen. I would share a smaller, more practical technique that I've started experimenting with some BBC colleagues who are here, which is that as pressure has been exerted on the information we're all being offered in the last, well, particularly the last 5-10 years, out of that has grown some journalistic responses. So fact-checking, for example. A politician gives a speech, a few days later, a long, detailed fact check on what that politician said is posted. Or Russia gives a press conference at the UN on Monday night, the press conference is broadcast, and then after it, people will go on and say, well, this was true and that wasn't true. Some of the work that we've been doing at the BBC is to move that checking into the original reporting,
Yes.
into the original product, so that you're not having to consume the story and then at a later point
Yes.
consume the fact check.
Which you may or may not get
Which
to.
you may or may
Absolutely.
not. You have to position both the evidence of something being true or the evidence of something not being true in the moment.
That is actually a very good point that you were making, Ros. I think you saw that in the process of the nomination and confirmation of Supreme Court nominee
Right.
Ketanji Brown Jackson, now Justice-to-be Ketanji
Exactly.
Brown Jackson, because obviously there were a lot of specious claims about her record, about her qualifications, trying to discredit her as she made her way to becoming this historic Supreme Court justice. You had stories that were, really kind of checking Republican senators in real time who were attempting to question her and at the same time impugn her record, right? You had reporting that was pushing back against that, saying there is no evidence of this. In fact, there is no basis for this line of questioning.
But it does pose, of course that should happen, but it poses some really difficult practical challenges for all of us. So that's one example from this week. Here's another. The Russian press conference at the UN on Monday night fell in the middle of my show on BBC World News.
Okay.
And of course, you want to hear what the Russians are saying. How do they explain the horrific footage coming out of Bucha near Kiev? So you want to hear their explanation, but at the same time, you can't broadcast their false claims about what happened in Bucha on the BBC without check. And so I'm on the TV going, here come the Russians, and the press conference starts, and I'm interrupting. I don't know how many times I interrupted in half an hour, but more than I've ever done on any press conference, because it was so uncomfortable that what they were saying was so clearly untrue and grotesque in the context of the evidence that had emerged from Ukraine. But at the same time, to not hear the Russians offer their explanation also felt uncomfortable, because to understand this conflict, you have to understand how Russia is creating narratives around it. And so I'm not saying we got it 100% right, but these are really delicate decisions.
So that's a great editorial question, which is, why would you broadcast that live?
Live. That's exactly what I was going to ask.
Why would you broadcast it live? It's available live. I'm sure it's streamed live, kind of, in many, many different places. So then it becomes, I think, about kind of how your brand or your practices as a journalism organisation align with your kind of editorial values, and it could be, and we had this problem with Trump, which is there is no getting away from the fact that the Russians speaking live at the UN, that a Donald Trump press conference or rally or whatever, is a magnet for audiences.
Sure.
But you will have to balance the magnet for audiences with actually with the responsibility. If the BBC said, look, we're not actually going to broadcast this live, because we're really dubious about whether or not we can frame this editorially, given the time.
Right, and you can tell people that it's happening.
Yeah.
But also, you can do that without necessarily amplifying the misinformation that you were anticipating is going to come from an event like that.
Let me give you another example, because perhaps this is also useful. And I suppose the point I'm making here is not that I've worked this out, but these are things that we're wrestling with.
Absolutely. We are navigating a post-truth world together.
So for the first month of this war, Russia has relentlessly claimed that it's about denazification.
Right.
Yep.
And Ukraine has relentlessly pushed back at that. And we know that how the Russians categorize denazification in Ukraine does not connect with the evidence, with the facts. There's one school of thought which is, by addressing what the Russians are saying, you're amplifying the message and creating associations with Ukraine that are based on false information. There's another thing, which is, if you don't touch that as a major global news organization like the BBC, people start saying, why is the BBC not correcting this false information? And so we spent a week producing a quite long 9-minute video, essentially concluding and saying that what Russia is saying is not rooted in fact.
Right.
And some people came back to us and said, you should never have made that video. More people came back to us and said, we're glad you made that video because we were wondering. But these are really, really delicate decisions, and perhaps we'll hear from everyone here about when you do and when you don't do that.
Yeah, so I really disagree with some people who I greatly respect in the field of disinformation research with the never repeat something which is untrue. I think it's really unhelpful, and I think if we come away from this era going, the one thing that journalists should never ever do is actually, amplify an untruth, by even repeating it, even to debunk it. That is, in this world where you have completely different spheres, that's not possible, it's not wise, and it's not helpful. So I think, kind of great that you made a 9-minute video.
I agree.
Because it's a really complex and actually important issue that people understand. Where does denazification come from? Why are the roots of it in the Second World War? Why does Putin's kind of generation of people in Russia think the way they do? Why is he kind of harking back not just to kind of Stalinist Russia, but to actually kind of like Tsarist Russia? Like, those bits are, kind of really important for people to understand. Getting everybody to engage in them, totally different.
Yeah, but you're not going to get everybody, right? And you go into it knowing that, right? You reach the people that you can reach. You hope that they can also reach some people that maybe you couldn't reach because of who they are, their relationship to the people that we're trying to reach, right? But I think I agree with you. It's not repeating disinformation just for the sake of doing it. I think there's value in a video like that because, number one, yes, you are helping people to understand what it is that they're looking at, understand that this is not true, understand why it's not true. You're giving them the context that puts us on a continuum, right? This is not happening in a vacuum, right? This is part of a long, right? So you give people that you are actually using that disinformation to help people understand and arm themselves and empower themselves with the truth.
But I do think that all of us almost need to, I was talking about this with my editor yesterday, it's like we almost need to put in place policies for how do we approach these different challenges of disinformation. So I'll give you another example.
Agree.
Boris Johnson in Parliament in February said something about the leader of the opposition in the UK connected to a paedophile that wasn't true.
Yeah.
And I made a video outlining why this wasn't true, and I got lots of criticism from supporters of the opposition, not criticism from the Prime Minister's supporters, criticism from the supporters of the opposition saying, why did you report on this? And I was like, well, because it was said in Parliament and so on.
Yeah.
But I think that journalistically, I feel like we've been feeling our way with this as a situation has evolved at quite some speed, and that it is useful for journalistic organizations to have, each decision is going to be individual, clearly, but having policies in place, and Trump definitely, as a presenter on a 24-hour news network, forced us to reevaluate our policies on these things.
Yes, but again, your instinct is right in that this is a public service.
Yes.
We are serving the public at the end of the day. That is the audience. People who are in positions of power, who have a problem with what it is that we are doing, means we're probably on the right track. Right. Whichever side has a problem with what we are doing means that we are probably on the right track.
I think that's absolutely right. And that thing of service, public service, and also,
and we have to get back to that.
Yeah, and I think as reporters and editors, we've always been kind of really captivated by what's happening right now. That's our job in news. It's news is news, but we're also constructing a public record, and I think often that's forgotten, and the holes in the public record bother me now almost as much as actually the sort of the practice of in the moment, which is, the kind of your alerts on your phone and now your kind of news service, your website is the archive, and we have to have, we have to have an accurate record of what happened.
But can I interrupt you and pick up on this point of in the moment, because it seems to me this gets to the heart of our challenge here, which is that if you've got information sources pouring at you from politicians, from people, from all around the world, and as journalists you're trying to sift through what's true, what's not true, sometimes doing that in the moment is close to impossible because you don't know the information that's going to come at you. So if you're, an obvious example would be a Donald Trump press conference. We don't know what Donald Trump's going to say, and you can be as expert as you like on US politics and on America more generally. You still can't be 100% sure you're going to know every element of what he's going to say and whether you can fact check that in the moment. And it seems to me there is a tension that we're wrestling with here, which is that we all consume journalism in the moment via Twitter, via live pages, via 24-hour TV, via radio streams, or whatever the example might be. But actually to catch the mistruths, to provide the factual context in that moment is incredibly difficult to do.
It is, but I think the 24-hour relentless news cycle has gotten us into the idea, I mean, it's just like Emily was saying earlier, we don't owe our audiences news at the expense of, I mean, we don't owe them news that is prioritized as the fastest. We owe them news that is accurate. If it takes a minute for us to get to what is accurate, if we're not the first ones out, and I say that as somebody who hates getting beaten. I'm not that journalist, right? I live and die for scoops and want to report things as quickly as I'm able, but I also want to get it right. I want to get the story right. I don't want to look back and be a journalist that was contributing to a post-truth, America, a post-truth democracy.
But I think it comes back as well to this issue of like how big a change are you willing to make. So it's really challenging for the BBC to say, maybe actually sort of mediating and relaying the feed is not the thing that we do anymore because it's kind of everywhere. You can get the feed wherever you want.
Yes.
So is it still our job as a news organisation to go live to events?
What is the value that we're delivering?
What is the value that we're delivering there?
Service?
But many times doing that would be a service and would be of value. It depends on, I don't think you're ever going to get in a situation where you make a blanket decision not to take anything live because you couldn't catch it.
You should never make a blanket decision about anything, and this is one of the things that sort of slightly annoys me about things like rules about disinformation, which is never repeat. It's like journalism is so specific and contextual, it's culturally specific, it's deeply contextual. The reason we have so many editors is because actually all we do as good news organisations is make really fine-grained decisions every single day about, is this the right moment to do this? What are we saying about ourselves? How are we helping the audiences understand a story if we approach it in X way or Y way? And I think really everything that we're talking about here is how we make that adjustment given how much has changed in the rest of the information environment. And as I say, it's kind of not rocket science in that sense, but it is a really big adjustment, and it is that sort of adjustment of you have to have different leadership, you have to have different techniques, you have to have a different kind of, and that's hard for kind of cultural organizations like the BBC that have been doing what they've been doing for 100 years.
Institutions, right. And that's an in-the-moment conversation, but it's also an ongoing conversation for everybody's individual newsroom, but also for us as an industry.
Now, I just mentioned with about 20 minutes to go, because we're not doing questions from the floor, if you want to tweet me questions, I can pass them on to Errin and Emily in the next 20 minutes. So by all means, at BBC Ros Atkins is where you can find me. While they come in, let me ask you one more question, because it struck me as the BBC has supported me making our explainer videos, that really committing to providing high-protein, truthful reporting is, to state the obvious, expensive, right?
Yep.
My videos are not a solo effort. There's a team behind them, and they're doing serious work which takes time.
Yes.
And there's huge amounts of oversight, and so while it might end up at 5 minutes, there's a lot of work that has gone into that. Mm-hmm. And in America, certainly I observe that one of the biggest growth areas in America has been opinion journalism, which on the whole can be cheaper. Mm-hmm. And how do we navigate that? How do we navigate the fact that to be as truthful as we possibly can be and to demonstrate why what we're writing or producing is truthful and make that a product that is popular? All of that requires significant investment.
No, absolutely. And look, I mean, it is very affirming for us at the 19th that so much of our journalism is supported. I mean, we are a nonprofit newsroom, but we are supported in a number of different ways, whether that is through private funding, philanthropy support, but also the thousands and thousands of members who pay as little as $19 a month to support the work that we do because they believe in what we are doing and because they feel like we are actually serving them as an audience, right? Again, it goes, I mean, for us, it really goes back to, and increasingly in the 2 years that we've been in existence, public service journalism, journalism that is responding to the daily needs of our audiences, whether that was in the pandemic, letting people know, as much as we could, how to navigate the pandemic, whether that was testing, whether that was how to address caregiving, whether that was how to get access to resources, to right now with like I said, the attack on voting rights and access to the ballot in this country. We know, as these primaries are underway, headed into the midterms, what do voters need more than anything? They need explainers. How do I vote, right? Where is my precinct? How do I find that information out, right? Like, we are trying to empower people in these moments of uncertainty, in the barrage of information that is not necessarily news, right, but that they are consuming and that is confusing them in terms of how they participate and get involved in this democracy. That's fascinating, isn't it, that you see your work not just as being reporting, but providing clear information about the experience of being in America. But that is part of journalism. I mean, that is part of the public service part of journalism, right? Is really just explaining to people what is happening and how they are able to participate as a citizen.
Yeah, and I think that sort of some of the, like a lot of this is actually not new, News anchors have always been paid more than reporters, kind of columnists and newspapers have always been paid more than reporters. The kind of, the sort of showbiz photo budget is always bigger. But it has gotten
conflated, though, Emily, wouldn't you say? I mean, that's part of the problem.
So actually, my project Rockbridge, which I'm now completely obsessed with,
sure.
Also said, influencers, investigative journalism and influencers, and I've heard this as well in kind of, other discussions about, what happens when a significant part of your audience, I'm going to scare you with something now, which is I teach in a program with undergraduates in it. As a sort of a side gig, I usually teach graduate journalism students, and they're not journalism sort of concentrators, so they are more representative of college students, but very smart. And a few weeks ago, I said, well, you can hand in your assignments as long as we're not as long as World War III doesn't break out, like on Monday. And they went, what? And I said, well, so you know about Ukraine, right? And they were like, what?
Okay.
And I said, okay, and I was like, talk to me about like how you get, and they're like, well, I mean, essentially, it's kind of TikTok, right? It's like they are completely disintermediated, and they would never go to the BBC website for anything. They would never come to the Guardian website for anything. They probably wouldn't go to the 19th website for anything, but they will see it in the stream, and that's sort of, again, kind of how do we connect with those audiences? And your point about conflation, Errin, is absolutely on point, which is, do we need to slightly change the messenger? And Ros,
yes.
you're an exponent of this, I think. You're sort of blending that sort of reporting with a bit of personality.
Meeting people where they are.
Meeting people where they are.
Because that is definitely a part of this equation, too.
And that's challenging from a business point of view. I think it's really challenging for some newsrooms. And this is not just about like what we do in our practice. It's also about, we're doing this in a completely unregulated environment, basically now. And in America, it's really uncomfortable to talk about any kind of laws about, content moderation or whatever. You have the First Amendment.
Well, that's interesting. Would you like regulation? Do you think the media needs to be regulated in order to?
Yes, I do. Yes, I think it should be regulated.
And I think we also have to talk about who we're talking about when we talk about who the media is expanding to include,
right,
and who is a publisher.
Yeah.
And what their responsibility
The thing that makes me uncomfortable is sometimes I feel like legacy journalistic institutions feel like they have a kind of monopoly on, we know how to tell things properly, sure, and the new kids on the block don't. And I don't think all legacy institutions necessarily have the track record to assume the right to demand that.
I just think they're not going to have a business in like 5 years, 10 years' time. I mean, really, the audiences are deciding that really quickly.
Here's a question for you, Errin. It's not one I'm going to be able to answer, but I'm interested to hear how you do. Alex Maxey says, you were talking about building trust with audiences by sharing backgrounds and biases, but the BBC and other big companies don't allow reporters to speak openly about their views on Twitter. That's true. I can't share opinions on Twitter. Is that a hindrance to an open dialogue with the audience?
Well, see, I'm not talking about my lived experience, not necessarily in terms of my views or how I feel about anything like that. That's not the point of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that I am, a black woman with a, parent who was born in segregated America, and who is somebody who has, I'm a journalist who has voted in every single election since, my 18th birthday. Like, what does it mean for me to be somebody like that who is covering the moment that we now find ourselves in?
And can I ask you a practical question? How do you share that information within your writing and reporting? Does it sometimes fit comfortably? Does it sometimes feel awkward to place it within reporting on something that's... How do you make a decision about when to share more of yourself?
Well, I mean, what's interesting is that, so in the editor-at-large hat that I kind of wear now, I'm able to do that in a variety of ways. Like, I may write a story, but then, whatever, I'm on Twitter talking about, kind of giving context to a story that I'm writing based on my lived experience, or maybe I'm going on television as a cable news contributor, as a journalist, not a pundit, right? Talking about, and maybe then I can kind of inject some of what my background is and how I bring that to bear on my reporting. But I guess there are ways in which I can help familiarize myself with my audience, in addition to kind of the credibility of a 20-year-ish career in journalism covering issues of the intersection of race and culture and politics in this country that help to kind of bolster my bona fides, if you will, in terms of the things that I write about.
And I think it's really important to say that one of the reasons that so many newsrooms are having trouble with this at the moment is because of a non-diverse leadership.
Absolutely.
So for instance, if you have a young, diverse staff and they say, can we go on a protest? And if, I was the editor-in-chief and I said, no, I have no authority in that area, actually. I have no authority. I heard two really great newsroom leaders, both women, one black, one also person of color, and they were asked exactly this question, and one said, I tell my reporters absolutely not, because there are people in this community who come back to me and say, I saw your reporter there, etc. She has absolute authority. She understands that. She's kind of like, this is how this affects the community that we are reporting to. The other one said, I tell my reporters, no, you can be in the media pen, that's fine, you can go and observe, but I don't want to see you out there. And it's like it has an authority because of, the lived experience and the judgment of the people who are in charge. And, that is something that we absolutely have not done well enough on. And that fracture, I think, in authority over certain areas of coverage is that's a real issue for newsrooms. And you will not get the best young journalists coming through those organizations unless you change that leadership really sort of urgently, or you diversify it. I think that's critical.
Well, what I will add to that, though, Emily, I'm in agreement with that first editor that you mentioned, because I believe in channeling that lived experience into the work.
Yes.
That is not activist journalism.
No.
That is you being who you are, helping to produce a more honest and accurate record about who our society is.
Exactly, but I think it is really important, this issue, and this goes absolutely into every community and every area of the world, which is when you are a journalist, I think one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about in the profession is, what does it mean to be a journalist? And you also have to think, what does it mean to be a journalist to somebody that you are talking to? Like, what is that sort of, what is your responsibility to them? What's your responsibility to the community that you're reporting on? And I think that sometimes the impulse, particularly of young journalists, is like, well, I want to be involved in this and I want to do this and I should be able to do that. And it's like, well, okay, so do we want the police force able to do this? Do we want our doctors able to do this? We expect them to have a certain standard of fairness. And as journalists, we have to have a certain standard of fairness. And it doesn't mean, it absolutely means bringing your experience and where you're from. And I think that, the UK media, which is very, very, very different from the US media, but has really suffered from just, kind of, even when I entered the field, you had people who were, it has to be said, nearly exclusively white male, kind of. But you also have people from very different classes coming into journalism.
Yes.
And I don't see that anymore. And in fact, you know, we offer, you know, Columbia is a very expensive school, but we offer a lot of free rides to journalism students, you know, kind of probably more than people realize. But actually, you know, journalists kids who want to be journalists, but they come from economic insecurity, just don't want to enter the profession because it's not stable enough for them. It's becoming a kind of a sort of a luxury career, and that's a real problem as well.
And it is on us as an industry to create that pipeline and to create access for them to do that. We literally, and I have to say this, Ros, because we literally just this week launched our fellowship at the 19th that is specifically aimed at either graduates or alumni of historically black colleges, because they don't necessarily have the pedigree that a lot of newsrooms are looking for when they go looking for the next generation of journalists, but they are absolutely as qualified, capable, and talented as anybody else coming out of these J schools. But that's not who we've been traditionally looking for, and so that lived experience is being left out, but for the people who actually do see them and do see what they bring to this work. And are paying them a living wage, and a wage that allows them to get in and get a toehold and stay in this industry.
Very interesting. I'm not an expert on this, but I know the BBC has dropped the requirement of having a degree as to be.
We also do not require that in our.
Which is absolutely, you know, it used to be the case that almost nobody went into journalism had a degree.
Yeah,
it was like,
that's right.
And actually, the BBC. This is also why institutions, I think, are really important. So it's why something like the BBC having a large newsroom is really important, because you can use. You know, the BBC in the UK has used its. You know, I remember Pat Young saying, if you fail diversity quotas, it's like failing, you know, if you fail a financial target in a company, you're kind of punished for it. If you fail your diversity quotas, you should be punished for it. You know, that should be a management failure.
And if you tie diversity to an economic imperative in your institution, that solves a lot of the problem. Suddenly people care a lot more.
Exactly. But you can change the rules of it. You know, the BBC can change the rules of this, but you're also in a difficult position politically. I mean, that's, you know.
That's a whole other panel.
And
on the issue of fairness, I think one of the things that we've been experimenting with is that there may have been a time where a really established journalism brand, such as the BBC, automatically was seen as fair. Now, we still, I think, have the most trusted news brand in the world, which we're very proud of, and trust is the kind of one of the biggest things for us. But one of the things I've been working hard on is to try and reinforce that, to try and show why you should trust us, not just to hope that you trust us because of our reputation. And one thing that we do that's a very practical technique, which is proving very powerful when we place our journalism in heated areas such as social media, is to juxtapose any assertion that we're making with fact. So you don't just assert something and think the consumer of this is going to trust that this is true because it's a BBC journalist saying this. We will juxtapose the assertion of something with the evidence, not 2 minutes later in the report or 5 minutes or half an hour, like in that moment. And if you ever watch any of the videos we produce, you'll see it's a technique we're doing constantly. I'll say, this has happened, here's the evidence. This has happened, here's the evidence. And so you're constantly reinforcing the issues of trust and of fairness. So people who maybe don't, especially younger consumers, who maybe don't have all the associations that their parents might do with an organization like the BBC, are learning for themselves. We're showing them why we're fair.
And working to earn that trust instead of just expecting that it will be there.
And so that's been effective. There's a question here from Alessandro who says, taking, for example, this war, in this polarized world, how can we provide complexity, like telling all sides of reality, without making it seem like we're joining the aggressor's side? So I think this is an issue that comes up time and again with stories that we do, and people will say, well, by doing this report, you could help this politician or harm this politician or hurt this business or harm this business. And my view on this is always that I'm working towards a truthful and fair report. I'm not really working towards outcomes. I remember I did a session with the journalism school in India the other day, and one of the students, the journalism students, said, like, how do we measure the impact of our activism? And for him, activism and journalism was completely intertwined, and he was interested in measuring outcomes. But for me, whether I don't know, this just makes me old-fashioned or just different, my outcome is that you better understand the subject that I'm trying to explain. I'm not trying to influence the world. I'm just trying to explain it.
But that, again, I think is just, to use the P word, that is a privileged position to be able to... So if you're working as a journalist in India at the moment, I think you would see it very much as activism. And
quite possibly.
And there are lots of, I remember talking to a news editor from Ukraine a few years ago who said, how do I get my reporters to do anything which is not just combating propaganda? Like, that they have literally become kind of focused on, batting back everything that we're hearing from Russian-sponsored propagandists. And it's really hard then to do real reporting within that. So I think, this point about sort of, in different parts of the world, urgency and, I feel really squeamish at the moment about, you can't always publish the truth when you have it around Ukraine, because you don't know what the impact is going to be on people on the ground. You have to now think about the information that you're putting out there can endanger lives in the moment.
Yes.
And I think that will change your practice. It means that you will cover that story very differently to how you'll cover this story.
Although I think journalists have been making those calculations around conflicts.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That's not a new phenomenon.
I think they're getting harder, is what I mean. I think that sort of these days there are no rules, and we don't really know. Security is much harder to, I think, imagine. But as you say, kind of you're not working towards outcomes. It's going to test us, I think, because, we're in a year now where you've got half a dozen elections, including here in Europe and in America, which are going to be. They're going to have a really profound effect on the course of democracy. Mm-hmm. And Washington Post has just sort of said, we're going to introduce a pro-democracy desk. And you think, how utterly bizarre that the Washington Post would think that it needs to, isn't that what it does every day when it comes in? But underlining that, I think, is kind of appropriate in the moment.
Yes.
And so these things will change according to your context, according to where you are. So I think what you're doing, Ros, absolutely the right thing for the BBC and the audience in the moment. Is it right for somebody in India? It's different.
And what you are making a good point about this being in part about privilege. At the 19th, we have two of the few openly trans reporters in a mainstream newsroom in the country, right? The attack on trans people in this country, in our country, in state legislatures across America, is real, right? Like that is a fact, that is happening, right? Like their dignity and humanity is up for debate in state legislatures in America. For them, this is not, there definitely is an outcome that they are trying to avoid, right? Like, this is existential for them, what we are seeing unfold. And so yes, it is absolutely about getting people to kind of understand what the issue is, but we're not both sides in people's humanity. At the 19th, that's not what we're going to do, and that's part of what I mean when I say that we have to jettison this myth of objectivity, because it is literally a matter of survival for certain people whose very existence is seen as up for debate and open for discussion, and for journalists to kind of both sides that or do anything that is not about getting to the truth is problematic.
I've got one final question for us, and we've about a minute, so I'm going to ask you to be very, very
Lightning
quick.
round.
But it's an interesting one. So you were saying, Errin, you've got to go to where the audience is. Teresa is saying, but if you go to where the audience is onto social media platforms, are you essentially stepping into an arena which is an uncomfortable place for the truth, where the truth is being tested and pulled one way or the other? And does that create a tension between your journalistic aspirations and the environments in which you're trying to deliver the journalism? I appreciate you could write a book on that, but in the 30 seconds you've got.
No, in the history of journalism, when have we not gone to the uncomfortable places to tell the truth? That is our job, that is our charge, and that is that is something that feels more urgent and necessary than as urgent and necessary as it has ever been.
And I can see you nodding your head, Emily.
Totally, 100% agree. Also, if you're not in those spaces, the kinds of things that are moving into those spaces are really sinister. And I'm going back to Project Rockbridge here, but just bear in mind that all the tools we use, all the techniques we use, engaging communities, et cetera, somebody who really, really does not want the truth to get out there is using the same tools, techniques, and language. And to some extent, you are, Errin, 100% right. We've always operated in that arena. We've never been in comfortable spaces. And our problem is perhaps we've been in too comfortable a place for too long. And, you know, that's coming to an end. Kind of.
Teresa, thank you very much for your question. I'm not sure where you are, but thank you. And of course, the BBC is in these spaces. I think all we would say is that we don't just charge into them. I'm sure lots of news organizations don't. We spend quite a long time thinking about how do we want our journalism to manifest itself in these different places so that when we step into them, we're not, of course, confident we're going to get it right, but we hope we've done the work to give ourselves the best chance. That is it. The hour's up. Thanks very much indeed for listening to us.